were to say, quote me something from Ecclesiastes, what pops into your head?
Vanity, vanity.
Good. Vanity of vanities. Everything
Yes.
is vanity.
Nothing new under the sun.
Good. We have nothing new. Under the sun. Anything else?
The time to be born, time to die, all that,
Right.
that long spiel.
Good.
Okay, I'm not saying anything else. I'm gonna be quiet.
Okay, good. We're saying time too. So,
For everything there is a season.
right. That's that same for everything. There's a season. We are going to look at Ecclesiastes primarily through the lens of these two passages. Because these two passages, knowing and there's nothing new under the sun fits really well into this. There's not, for everything there's a season. And we'll see how it kind of fits into the general theme and message of Ecclesiastes. But we're going to focus on these two to kind of to help us get our minds wrapped around what's going on in the book of Ecclesiastes. So first, just a couple general notes about the book. The traditional, who the book is traditionally accredited to is Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Why would that be the case?
Because it starts, I said I wasn't gonna say anything else. I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, it's good. I appreciate you opening the floor up. Why is it generally credited to Solomon?
Because it lends his wisdom to the book or something.
How so?
Well, I mean, if you credit it to Solomon, it automatically has more weight or something.
Okay, good. So we've got that same thing like we talked about with Proverbs and the Psalms. Good.
And he starts out saying that he's the son of David.
Yeah. Right. So if we pull this up real quick, right? The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So we think, okay, who is the son of David, the king, right? So we have this kind of traditional kind of attributing of this work to Solomon. But for the most part, the way that it refers to the author and the name that this book actually has in Hebrew, as you read, is Kohelet. And that's this word here, the preacher. Right? The word literally means assembler. Right? And it's not really clear what this title means. Right? Is this somebody who assembles people together? Is this somebody who has assembled a lot of proverbs and sayings together, right, into this book? So it's not really clear what this title means. But this is the name that the book has in Hebrew. And probably, maybe mysteriously what the author was kind of going by, calling himself or herself, the preacher, or the gatherer. And this book, like the other ones that we've been looking at right now, dates to somewhere between the 5th and 3rd centuries. So where does this place the book, what's going on during this period?
They're going back.
Right, yeah. So we have, this is, during the return, or they are returned, right? This is post-exilic. So, right, so think, you guys know a lot about this post-exilic period, about what's going on during this period, about the tensions, about the frustrations.
This is diaspora, right?
Well, diaspora, we are kind of in the time of diaspora, right? But, the Jews who have returned to Israel would not say they are in diaspora anymore, right? Because they are back in the homeland. They're not scattered. They're not dispersed anymore, right? But it is kind of during the time when you do have Jews in diaspora. Yeah, for sure. And like Proverbs and and a lot of other kind of books we've been looking at right now, this is a collection of sayings. Right? It's a collection of thoughts, of proverbs. And this was probably one of the last books included in the canon, and was one of the most hotly debated books, whether to include or not. Right? Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and I believe Esther were three of the most hotly debated books. Esther, because it never mentions God. Song of Solomon, because it's pretty racy at times. And then this book, because of some of the message that we'll be looking at. Right? So let's dig into that. Let's dig into what's going on here. Well, let's start with this classic line that it starts with. Vanities of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Just checking this out in Hebrew. You can kind of hear it even in the Hebrew, right? Havel havalim amar kohelet. Havel havalim hakal havel. Right? It even sounds more repetitive than the English does in a way. Right? And you see here in this one sentence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, it's using pretty much that same word. Right? And what do we know about when Hebrew repeats words?
Just trying to make a point.
Right. This part right here, Havel Havalim, vanity of vanities. Think of this as somebody saying best of the best. Right? Or worst of the worst. Right? That's what that's trying to say. When it says vanity of vanities, it's saying this is the most vain thing you can think of. Right? The most vain. Right? Doesn't get more vain than this. And this word is really important in the book of Ecclesiastes. And just to show how central it is, if we click on the Strong's number, you see here in Ecclesiastes, you see where my mouse is? It appears 30 times in this short little book of 12 chapters, right? It appears in Ecclesiastes more than any other book in the Hebrew Bible, right? The next one is Psalms here, right, in Jeremiah. But 30
so
times.
long.
So this concept, right, in Jeremiah is huge. Right? Ecclesiastes, we have 12 short little chapters, and it appears 30 times. So this is a really central concept. So it's going to behoove us to kind of get an understanding of what Havel means in order to understand what the book of Ecclesiastes is talking about. Now, the traditional translation right here is vanity. That is not a word that I think almost anybody uses anymore, other than to refer to the thing that they see themselves in the mirror. Right? It's your vanity. This word kind of literally means, or is taken from the word, it means breath. Right? It's kind of literally the thing that if you are cold outside and you breathe and it appears, right? That's Havel. Right? If you breathe on a piece of glass and it shows up and it disappears really quick, that's Havel or Hevel. Right? That's what this word is getting at. And because it has that kind of literal meaning of this breath, right, it also has the kind of metaphorical meaning of, we could say vanity, but what might help us better is if something is fleeting. Right? Think of how fleeting that vapor is. Right, this is mist, vapor. This is, if you want to write it down, it's just Havel.
I was just getting ready to
Right? Vanity, fleeting. We can also talk about Havel as being if something is absurd. Right? This could be saying absurdy of absurdities, says the preacher. Absurdity of it's really hard to say, of absurdities. All is absurd. We could also translate it meaningless. All is meaningless. Right? Kind of going along with this idea of things that are absurd. If we look at 8, see if I can click down here, 8:14. Where it appears, whoops, too far. Come on. right? There is a vanity which is done upon the earth, right? You guys see this? Oh, well, you did see it. There it is. There's a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there be just men. Oh, this is in the. Let me change this a little bit, a little more readable. Oh, come on. Maybe. Let's see here. See what the ESV does for us. Okay. There's a vanity that takes place on the earth. That there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. Right? That's absurd. Right? The righteous people are getting kind of the rewards or punishments of the wicked, and the wicked are getting the rewards or punishments of the righteous. Right? And that's absurd. Right? And so we can see kind of how this word here, havel, has this kind of metaphorical breadth to it. Right? And it's the same word. I mean, this is the word that we get used to reference idols. Right? Idols get referred to as havel. Beauty gets referred to as havel, right? Which kind of lends itself to this kind of notion of fleeting. Now, what's really interesting, too, just to take a look at this, if we turn to Genesis 3 here, I think it's 3, might be 4. Let me skip ahead one. Doug, familiar? This is also the name that we translate Abel. And think about the character of Abel, right? He is there for a second and he's gone, right? He should. Right?
So is it
yeah.
Havel?
Havel. It's the same word.
Oh, okay. So we both of those words get transferred into translated.
Yeah. Well, okay. This B and this V are the same letter in Hebrew.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. Yeah.
I did it wrong.
H-E-B-L. This is the same word. Right. This little character is a bait, and it looks like this, and it can be pronounced a V or a B. That letter in the middle. Right. So think about the character of Abel, right? He's there. He doesn't do anything in the story, right, except get killed. Right? So not only is his presence in the story fleeting, but it seems also absurd and meaningless. Right? It's most likely not an accident that this is why this character has this name in this story. Right? Because of this kind of place. So we could, in a sense, when we're looking at that passage in Ecclesiastes, just almost translate it, like Abel's of Abels, everybody is Abel. Right? Everybody is a fleeting, meaningless character in this grand story. Right? This is the first passage pretty much in Ecclesiastes after it just introduces the author. Right? This is how the book starts. And we see here, if we continue with this idea of because everything is meaningless and absurd and fleeting, that humankind's efforts don't really matter. Right? What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever, the sun rises, the sun goes down, so on and so forth. But man gains nothing by all his work. Right? And we even have this idea that not only is all your work meaningless, but it doesn't even matter in the end. Right? If we scoot down to 3, let's see. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, right, to mankind, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Right? For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over beasts. For everything is absurd and fleeting and meaningless. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Right? What you do in this life doesn't really matter. Has no grand effect on anything. Right? If you're wicked or if you're righteous, what difference does that make? Right? You can see why this book would be kind of hotly debated as to whether or not you want to include this in your canon. Right? With this kind of cynicism. So this is what the book is kind of getting at with this repetition of Havel, right? Of vanity. So let's take a look at this time. There's a time for everything, right? That's right up here. That's actually at the beginning of this chapter. Now, who here, does anybody know the Birds song? Right? I think almost everybody. Turn, turn, turn. Right? And they pretty much like go through this whole passage. Right? And a lot of times, how does this, when you guys have heard this passage in the past, like what kind of message is generally being communicated with this? Like what is somebody trying to communicate to you if they say for everything there's a season?
To wait until it's your time to do something.
Okay.
Or I hear it at funerals.
Funerals. Okay. There's a time, right? There's a time for death. But don't worry, things are going to get better. Right?
Yeah, or you didn't get that job, but that's because it's not your time.
Right, it's not your time. Just wait. Right? What?
That I haven't done
Right. Just hold on. So let's think about seasons, right? We have summer, and summer goes to fall. Fall goes to winter. Winter goes spring. And the spring goes back to summer. So think about what this passage is really saying, right? Yes, there is a passage, there is a time for healing and building up. And there's a time for these awful things too. But a lot of times when people use this passage, they say, oh, you're here, don't worry, because soon you're going to be here. Right? But this passage is also saying, hey, guess what, you're here, check it out, you're going to be there soon.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right? Because the thing about seasons is they're cyclical. Right? What you do doesn't matter. This thing is going to keep spinning. Right? Things are great, well, just hold on, because they're going to get bad. Right? Because we have to set this in the context. Look, right after the author goes through all of this, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Right? This starts with the same thing. What is the worker for his toil? This is the same question we had earlier. He has made everything beautiful in his time. He has put eternity into man's heart so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Right? Other translations say God has put a sense of past and future into man. But man has no idea what God is doing. Right? I perceive that there is nothing better for them to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Right? In a sense, the effort that you want to put into things, to try to fix things, to change things, to make your life better, to make other people's lives worse maybe, it doesn't matter. Right? All that you'll gain for your toil is nothing because you're stuck on that same cycle. Now this is really interesting and a little bit, how do I want to put this? I'll put it as a question. How would this idea of time and everything else being cyclical, how would that mesh with the kind of view of time that we've seen in the rest of the Hebrew Bible?
What is it, and those R's in it.
Oh, with Judges?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of got the cycle in Judges.
Repentance.
Right, but now let's think about that cycle in Judges. Because what happens by the end of that cycle?
It starts back all right there.
In a sense, what about the end of the book of Judges? Like what by the end of that story, because we talked about not only is it just a cycle, but it's a
Spiral.
because it keeps getting more and more out of control until so kind of saying this is why we need this is why we need a king. Right? This is why we need a king to break this. Right? So like let's bring David along. Right? And so think about all the moments in Jewish history that matter. Right? So for example, Sinai. Right? Sinai is a critical point in the history of Jewish identity. Right? Before that, freedom from Egypt. So we move through Sinai. We're forming into a people. We're given that identity in Sinai. Right? We have the Davidic covenant. Right? We have the return from exile. What's interesting about Ecclesiastes is it's kind of saying this past and whatever kind of future you want to look to, whatever kind of messianic hopes or apocalyptic hopes you have, they don't matter. Because everything is just on this cycle. There's nothing in the past that's going to dramatically alter the cycle, and there's nothing in the future that will dramatically alter it. Right? So it's interesting that the book of Ecclesiastes is setting up this cycle and saying, look, time is just cyclical. You can't do anything to change this. It's interesting because it seems to throw this history out the window. There's this kind of ahistorical or anti-historical notion behind the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Because it has this cyclical kind of setup, right? The Deuteronomistic history has this kind of linear progression, right? Everything leads up to the Davidic kingdom. And everything that we're going to see with like apocalyptic literature when we look at Daniel and when we've looked at some of these other prophets is very much a looking ahead, right? Ecclesiastes is saying, look, don't worry about looking ahead, right? It's just the cycle. Right. So this whole like Exodus and Day of the Lord stuff, right? When we think about when we hear prophets, when we heard the prophets talking about the Day of the Lord, right, as being this huge catastrophic, into a timeline, right? Ecclesiastes there's not a line to this.
So that means it would happen more than once. If we're going to.
Well, it's just saying, look, if there is a part where, if there's a time when God judges us, it might look like fall and winter. Or if we're vindicated, it'll look like spring or summer, but we're just going to keep spinning around here. Yeah. It makes it really difficult to say that there's anything in the future that's going to have any significant impact on just how things spin. Right? So we have to set, this whole idea of there's a time for love and a time for laughter and dancing kind of in context with the rest of it. We're kind of just setting up, or the author is very much setting up just this cycle. Right? That there are these divinely decided times for these things, but you're not going to bring them yourself. Right? And what he kind of gets to, and we'll get just back to this, or no, sorry, it's very confusing. We're going to talk about the first part, and the second part we'll get to, is that, so we can't perceive anything, right? There's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live, right? He said, humans cannot find out what God has done from beginning to the end, right? What book does that sound like? Humans can't find this out. Huh? No, which book we just talked about?
Joe.
Yeah. Right? Humans can't figure this out. You're a human. You have a tiny little brain. You can't figure this out. Right? Ecclesiastes say, be joyful. Just be happy in the moment you have, because you ain't figuring this out.
We don't know when he's coming.
Well, that's, again, the him coming that doesn't matter. Right? Because we're on the cycle. Right? It's not going to really, there's no kind of history to look forward to. Right? It says just be joyful. It doesn't say look ahead because there's good things coming. It says look right now, this is all you got. Because everything else is fleeting, absurd, and pointless.
Does that mean the same thing as they say history repeats itself over and over?
That's kind of a modern interpretation of it, yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a cynical, modern perspective on it, yeah. And that's the thing, it's hard not to read Ecclesiastes as being very cynical. It just seems like an incredibly cynical book. That all you can do is be happy. Let's talk about this kind of idea, running out of space, that Ecclesiastes shares with Job is this idea of hidden wisdom. Right? The hidden nature of wisdom. Let's go forward real quick to see if I can put in just a abbreviation here. There we go. Okay. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 8. I'm going to drop down to 16 and 17. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on the earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes sleep. Then I saw all the work of God. The man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he can't find it out. Right? This is that same kind of rejection of, oh, you just need to figure out how to live life, and then live that way, that we saw in Job. Right? Remember Job's critique to all his friends? Right? And we see the same thing, right? We just talked about how in Ecclesiastes, he has this recognition that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. Right? That Job has. That same observation that, hey, like all this wisdom that you're espousing, I don't really see it. In fact, I see the opposite. And because of that, don't try to figure out like some kind of cosmic plan for how you should live. Right? Because you can't. There's this idea that wisdom is hidden.
It kind of discounts Proverbs.
It does. It very much, Ecclesiastes and Job very much come into conflict with the kind of wisdom tradition that we saw in Proverbs. For sure. And this is why, this is one reason that I think the Hebrew Bible is so interesting, is because it maintains these very different traditions. It doesn't try to, or at least I do not see in the Hebrew Bible this kind of ironing out of differences within a community. Right? There's a community here that is contributing these texts and contributing these stories. And I don't see the later editors coming through and trying to iron them out and say, okay, here's our holy book, and it all makes sense together. Right? It's really hard to bring Ecclesiastes and Job into and say them right at the same time, in the same breath with the book of Proverbs.
And it also kind of, it makes sense why, I think earlier when we were talking about how they said this was attributed to Solomon, because he was, because of all the wives he had, he caused some of the judgment, but, and then if they read that kind of, to me.
Right. Think about that. I think someone brings up a good point in saying, so when we looked at the Deuteronomistic history, right, it said, oh, these people fell because of this problem, and these people fell because of this problem, right? Ecclesiastes is saying, you can't do that kind of calculation, right? You can't figure out when God is going to do things, right? You can't say, oh, there's this punishment, so obviously something was done wrong. Right? Ecclesiastes is very much rejecting that view. Right? Rejecting that view that we see in the Deuteronomistic history. Would you say, Thelma?
I'll say you always reject punishment.
Yeah. This is a good voice to listen to sometimes when you hear TV preachers say things like, oh, well, New Orleans was flooded because of blah, blah, blah. You're like, it's a good thing to kind of balance that out with.
There's also a passage in the Bible says it rains on the just as well as the unjust.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And the author here even goes so far as to say, not only can we not, know how to live in this life, but kind of in saying that in other words, right? Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifices of fools, for they do not know what they are doing is evil. Right? We have here that he's even refusing, he says, be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Right? So, the author is here saying, look, here's what I observe on earth. Here's all that I can say. I'm not going to speculate on heavenly matters. Right? So that's another kind of interesting distinction with the Deuteronomistic history. Right? Whereas the Deuteronomistic history is very much like someone was saying, is saying, oh, here's how heaven is responding to these matters on earth. The author of Ecclesiastes is saying, look, here's what I see on earth. I'm not even going to speculate on why this is the case.
And number 5:1, that kind of brings you back to with Cain and Abel too. You know, how you said Havel is, because, you know, it's differences of the sacrifices.
Right. Drawing your listen is better than to offer sacrifice, right? So we have here, it seems kind of a slight condemnation of like cultic life, right? Saying like, oh, if we just offer sacrifices, then we will sway God to act one way or another,
Yeah.
right? That we'll have some kind of hand in how things work out on earth. Yeah, and he's saying that's not the case at all, right? And speaking of that kind of rejection of the Deuteronomistic history, if we look here to, let's see, find my place. Starting with 8:10. Let's see here. Used to go in and out of holy. Right. 10 through 14, what we get is this kind of rejection of delayed punishment. Right? And as all the wicked buried, they used to go in and out of the holy places and were praised in the city where they had done such things. Right? Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man, we can just say the heart of mankind, is fully set to do evil. Right? There's no like speedy, it's not like as soon as you do something bad, God strikes you down. Right? And the author says because that's not the case, because we don't have this like immediate kind of punishment, that humans just feel like we can get away with it. Right? Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked. Right? Neither will he prolong his days. And this is what's interesting about Ecclesiastes, is we get some parts like this that seem that despite all this rejection of wisdom tradition, it seems to kind of say, well, maybe the wicked will get what they deserve, right? But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before the Lord. Look too at how Ecclesiastes ends. It's been often speculated that this is an additional ending by a later editor who isn't really comfortable with how cynical Ecclesiastes is. Right? Go one more. There we go. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. Right? You got kind of this editorial ending, right? Kind of talking third person about Koheleth. But it says, "My son, beware of anything beyond these, and making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Right? So there's this like, yeah, okay, everything might be bad, but just be obedient. Right? And I'm not sure if I want to say it's editorial. It does seem to kind of fall back on this idea of fearing God, which is the beginning of wisdom. Right? So it's kind of, it's another one of these parts where it's hard to say, is this some later edition? Or is this kind of the book's just kind of struggle within itself to kind of know how to make sense, to know how to prescribe what to do next if all this is the case, right? And remember we saw in Job how Job kind of ended, that you can't make God this moral accountant, so the best you can do is obey the Torah, right? That's kind of how Job ended, and Ecclesiastes is kind of ending that same way. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Now, the one thing I want to say at the end here is there is one thing that the book of Ecclesiastes never says is hevel, never says is vain or absurd, and that's joy, which is really interesting. He says, look, everything else is meaningless, so just be joyful, right? So it's interesting, and it's not exactly a kind of carpe diem, like seize the day kind of thing, because the good things that Ecclesiastes does talk about is constantly referred to as gift. Right? So it's less seize the day and more receive a gift. It's kind of the one little like shining, the one kind of like silver lining to the book of Ecclesiastes is that the book of Ecclesiastes never calls joy fleeting, never calls joy hevel. Which is just kind of an interesting point. There kind of an interesting observation about the book of Ecclesiastes is it never does that. Right, so joy is never dismissed.
That's like the writer's point too, like anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just like you're here, so just enjoy it.
That's all you got.
Right.
Yep. So if you have this good moment, know that it's a gift, enjoy it, but don't hold on to it. Right? Don't think it's gonna last, but just enjoy it
Right.
while it's here. Yeah. Because that's all you can do. That is your lot as a human. Right? Which is interesting, and this is why I feel like the writer of Ecclesiastes or a later editor comes back and adds these things about fearing God. Right? Because on one hand, we have the author saying, the only prescription I have, based on my observations of the world, is just enjoy whatever moments you have. Right? Whereas we either have the author kind of struggling with what else to say other than just enjoy life, or we have a later editor saying, well, yes, enjoy life, but also fear God. Right? Like, keep God's commandments. So there's that tension within the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's important to realize that there's a tension there. In the same way that it's important to realize that there's a tension between Ecclesiastes and Job and the book of Proverbs. Yeah.
And assuming that it was one author. I mean, even if you assume that it's one author, then you can go back and look at it like a journal, or you know how you keep keep a daily journal. You might not feel the same way on one day.
Yeah.
You feel on another day, or even down through the years, or however long.
Yeah.
You know, you might come to a conclusion, but still leave what you had previously thought.
Yeah. And that's just one of the things that's difficult when looking at these ancient texts is we don't know. You know, we don't know if this was one person. We don't know if it's a school of thought. We don't know if it's just a collection of sayings from a community, from the entire Jewish community. It's like these are just sayings that get kind of floated around, and we're going to collect them into this collection that kind of bears this thematic wholeness to it. So it's just kind of hard to say. But it is interesting to keep in mind that the book of, it's kind of like, I think we saw this in Amos, right? In the book of Amos, it's like doom and gloom the entire way through. Then you get like 4 or 5 verses at the end that are like, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And it's just like, really? Like, did you really say this too? Or is somebody just kind of coming along later and be like, look, like, we need a little beam of sunshine. So, it's kind of that same kind of question when we read this in Ecclesiastes. I think the argument for this being kind of native to the book in a more holistic way is one, we see this at other kind of points in the book, like we just saw it in chapter 8. And also that this is kind of how Job ends as well. In the same kind of like, the most we have is Torah obedience, right? Even if wisdom is hidden, right? Even if we can't figure out the whole like cosmic scale thing, the most we can do is keep this tradition, right? And think about this in the context of what we said the setting was, which I guess I erased, right? The setting of post-exilic Israel, right? The struggle to maintain an identity as a people, right? The most we can do is maintain this identity that we have founded in the commandments, right? In the Torah. If we are a people founded around the Torah, then maybe we can maintain an identity, even if we have to kind of give up on this idea of how divine justice gets meted out in this life, right? So, this is kind of our look at the happy book of Ecclesiastes. Like I said, I really like Ecclesiastes and Job because they present this alternative voice within the Jewish tradition, and I feel really show the Jewish tradition struggling with its identity, struggling with its theological assumptions in the wake of their post-exilic